So today we're going to be getting to grips with conifers. Now, it's quite a big subject, so you're going to get the racehorse version.
Matt, we're actually seeing not the slideshow view. I don't know.
Okay.
You can see the next slide on the right. I don't know if that's what you're seeing.
Hold on.
Maybe try again.
A second. Let's try this version. Is that better?
Yes, that's perfect.
Excellent.
Great.
Good. Great stuff. I'll try and remember where I was in my little spiel now in that case. Okay, so it's a bit of a gallop today, but we'll see how we get on, and it'll hopefully give you a stepping stone into looking at conifers in more depth. So what are we going to cover today? We'll give a brief outline of what is a conifer. We'll look at conifers in the British Isles, how they got here, and then we'll look at starting to identify conifer genera. Now, going to species level within an hour would be next to impossible to cover more than about 4 or 5 species. So what I'm going to do today is give you a toolbox, if you like, to get you to the genera. And then it's a relatively easy step into the species, but hopefully you'll be able to get to conifer genera within about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes of approaching your unknown conifer. That's my aim. So let's see how we can get to that point today. So firstly, what is a conifer? Well, they're an ancient group of plants, and they've been around at least 300 million years. So they really are some of the earliest plants, and they could be considered primitive in some ways. They're technically also known as gymnosperms. So they have naked ovules. That is, they don't produce a fruit like an apple or a strawberry or something like that. Now, this is fairly important. The leaves are simple and they're always single or parallel veined. So we don't get that sort of network of veins that you might get in something like a sycamore or a daisy. Also important, they have separate male, i.e. the pollen producing parts, and female, the seed producing parts, cones, not flowers. Now, some of the conifers have very attractive female cones when they first emerge, but they're most definitely cones. And they're wind pollinated, so insects don't come into the equation at all here. And how about conifers in the British Isles? Well, 2 big factors really. Number one, the same as a lot of the wildlife in the UK, and that's the Ice Age. So this isolated the British Isles when the Ice Age finished, and basically if things didn't get across the land bridge before the North Sea formed, they weren't native. And as a result, we have a very limited flora and fauna. The other big influence is us in this particular case. So we've had a huge influence on the conifers in the British Isles. We only have 3 truly native conifers, and most people are probably familiar with yew because it's extremely widespread. Pretty much every grid square in the British Isles contains yew, usually in a churchyard, but also in the wild. Scots pine is similarly very common, and a lot of people will be familiar with that. And juniper, less common, but everybody I'm sure will be familiar with gin and tonic, and that's flavoured with juniper berries. So those are our 3 natives. Everything else is introduced, unless I was being a bit of a stirrer and said there are 2 other natives, but we might come to those later. The bulk of our conifers that we're going to see are exotic introductions, and there are 2 big reasons for this. Number one really is horticulture. You'll find a huge diversity of conifers in horticulture. The 70s especially saw a huge surge in interest in dwarf conifers. A lot of people found out the hard way they weren't really dwarf, they just grew a bit slowly. So quite often you'll see vastly outsized trees growing on old rockeries and things now. But also getting common as street trees, very common in cemeteries, churchyards, those kinds of places, parks as well, but also in forestry. And very limited range of species here. One in particular, Sitka spruce, accounts for about 56% of all of the tree plantings in Scotland. So that when I'm saying plantings here, I'm talking plantation forestry, not any other kind of thing. So 56% is one species. That's quite incredible. Next down the list is Scots pine, and that comes in at about 12%. So there's a huge leap there. What sort of resources might you use to help you identify conifers? Now, after the talk today, we'll actually send around a list which gives you some of what I think are the better resources and the more accessible resources. And they range from the standard field guide, if you like, which is the Collins trees, originally written by Alan Mitchell, and you can get one of the original copies. I think they're better. They also contain most of his pithy commentary. Have a look at his entry for Copper Beech, for example. He hated them. Next, getting a bit more technical, looking at the vegetative key, and this works superbly well with conifers because they actually key out very, very well just from vegetative features, which is a real plus. Then we start getting into the really technical publications like Conifers of the World, but I still think this is a good introduction if you're interested. That's a good next step. And then online. Now, the Arboretum Vespelaar in Belgium has a superb set of online keys and photographs of conifers. The keys are very technical, so you have to be a bit keen, but they are entire. They cover every species in a particular genus. So if you get really into it, head for the Arboretum Vespelaar. But as I say, I'll send around a list of resources once we finish the talk today. How about equipment? Again, you really don't need very much, but a ×10 hand lens is going to be your best friend as a botanist in all cases. So if you don't have one, strongly recommended. You do not need to spend a lot of money. A £3.50 hand lens will be as good in most cases as one of the ones that's up to sort of £75. So have a little look online. Summerfield Books is a really good place to get your first hand lens. Get yourself a lanyard as well and get using it. Binoculars. Now, conifers are quite often big. So the foliage, and especially the cones, might be 20 to 30 meters off the ground. And that's a little bit out of reach for your hand lens. So the best you can do really is find some binoculars, and they'll enable you to get a look at least at the sort of position of the cones up on the top of the tree, and maybe their shape and color as well, because those can be really helpful. Somehow I found a picture of a bobble hat with conifers on it, and really conifers are best observed in the winter. So there's none of those pesky broadleaves around to obscure the view and get in the way and distract you. So wrap up warm, get out and start having a look, because you might be surprised at what you can find, especially in Scotland. And if you're looking at recording conifers, there's actually a real lack of records. So finding the first record in Scotland, something like Korean fir, is surprising. But that was just down the road from where I live. Cupressus glabra, I've got 8 records for that now, first in Scotland. So I'm absolutely convinced there's a lot more out there. So if you get into this, you could be going around bagging first records, and definitely first county records, very quickly. How do we identify conifers? There's a range of characters. Some of them you can do from a distance. And the first of these is form or overall shape. So this is your general impression, and it might be sort of a classic teardrop shape on the top left there. It might be the incredibly recognizable outline of something like monkey puzzle, which frankly at 70 miles per hour in a car, you could spot a monkey puzzle. And there are a lot of those in Scotland, especially over on the west coast. It might be a very tall, narrow tree with branches that are a bit like ski jumps. So they appear to sort of drop down steeply next to the trunk and then twist upwards at the side. And that's Serbian spruce. There isn't anything else you're going to see growing in the British Isles that looks like that. So again, it's another really good thing to look out for. Bark. Now, the foliage is quite often way out of reach, but the bark will be imminently reachable. So it can be quite a nice thing to get familiar with. Now, the bark will change from young trees to older trees. So some of the other characters are more useful when the trees are younger. But descriptions like furrowed, fissured, divided into plates in the top left corner there, or perhaps it's fairly smooth with rows of these blisters, which you get on certainly some of the firs, and these will be filled with resin. Don't get tempted to pop them unless you're wearing glasses, because I guarantee you this will get you in the eye and it really stings. But just have a little poke and have a sniff, because the resin smells fantastic. Another feature of bark you might see is this kind of flakiness and paperiness, and quite a strong colour sometimes as well. In this case, the classic coral orangey pink of Scots pine. So bark can be a really useful first pointer as to what you're looking at in your conifer, and say it's accessible. If you can get some foliage, then buds are another good thing to look for. And we're looking at characters such as, what shape are they? Are they narrow and pointed? Do they taper to a very sharp point, like the middle picture? Or are they kind of rounded and quite small? Can we see the scales of the buds easily? And the picture on the left of Pinus pinasta, maritime pine, the bud scales curl back on themselves. So you get this sort of ostrich plume or shuttlecock-like appearance, very distinctive. Sometimes the buds are covered in resin, like the other two images here. So they have what appears to be sort of a white, slightly opaque or transparent coating. And that can also be a useful character to look out for. So buds are a good thing to look at. Cones. Cones, I think, are very useful because they can quickly separate out the genus. And quite often they fall off the trees. And so you can find them on the ground, even if you can't reach them or see them clearly with the binoculars. So things to look out for are, what position do the cones have on the tree? Do they stand upright, like the picture on the left? Or do they hang down like the picture on the right, kind of like carrots hanging up in the tree? And if you've got cones, do they have anything sticking out from between the cone scales? So the picture on the left has these little tongues or bracts sticking out. And what shape are they, or what colour even? Now, not all conifers have what are, at first glance, cones. One of these is our native yew, with those red berry-like things which are called arils. The seed is actually buried deep inside that. So not everything has true cones, but generally a conifer will have cones. But really, with conifers, it all comes down to the foliage. Now, this is where you really need to focus your efforts at observation. And it's a good time to say as well, when you walk up to a tree or any plant that you're looking at, first have a really good look at it from a distance and get a feel for the most common features, because plants, trees, conifers don't read the textbooks. And very often you'll get slightly apparent features which don't match the overall picture. So on the left there, we can see some nice little needles. Sometimes they might not appear in their normal form. So search over the whole tree and get a feel for what's the most common form of that particular feature. They might smell good or bad in some cases, but generally they smell good. Common description seems to be toilet cleaner. That might be good, it might be bad, depending on how much you like toilet cleaner. But certainly maybe give the leaves a little crush as well, very gently with your hand. You should be able to tell quite quickly if there's a particular smell. associated with that. Again, just a tiny little warning that some people are sensitive to a lot of these chemicals that conifers are packed with. So if you are one of those people, wear some gloves or get your botany companion to crush the foliage for you. But I'd encourage you to get out there and sniff the foliage, because there's a wide range of smells there, and there are entire keys to some genera based on the smell. It's very subjective, but it can be a really useful feature, and it's got a bit of fun as well. So what do we look for in the foliage? So really, the first big split is generally, do they look like needles or do they look like scales? Now, we need to take needles in the widest sense. So basically, are they long and thin and either flattened or perhaps quadrangular in cross-section or rhomboid, but they will always be longer than they are wide. And that we qualify them as being a needle. And by scales, essentially, I mean similar to fish scales or reptile scales. And these are actually little leaves that are very compressed and flattened. Now, I've chosen 2 images here as well that show the underside of these particular conifers. And you can see this extremely white colouring, and that isn't uncommon with conifers, but again, the location of that colouring, and whether it's a solid band or whether it's in discrete patches, can be helpful with the identification. And is it on all of the surfaces, so the top side and the underside, or is it just on one or the other, or perhaps it's just a few little white spots near the tip of a needle and the rest is clear of those white markings? So have a good look for that as well. But essentially, is the specimen you're looking at with needles or with scales? And really that's the big thing to look for when you first get the foliage in your hand. So first we're going to look at needle-like foliage and what are the characters of needle-like foliage and the variations that you need to look for. Now, for me, I would say the first thing you need to do is look at how those needles are arranged on the shoot. So we've established we've got needle-like foliage. How are they arranged on the shoot? So are they attached to the shoot or the twig singly? So is it just one needle coming out of an individual point on the shoot or the stem? Or are they in bunches of either 2, 3, or 5 that fall from the tree as a unit? So although conifers are generally evergreen, they do shed their needles, and you can usually find a good thatch of those beneath the tree. Or if you grab a needle and pull at it, in this case, it will come away as this little bunch. And right at the bottom of the middle picture there, you'll see a little kind of woody structure. This, together with the needles, is called a fascicle. And that is readily identifiable. And as we'll see in a moment, that takes you straight to a particular genus. The other needle arrangement you need to look for is, are they in clusters of more than 10? So we get this kind of chimney sweep brush effect in the picture on the far right, or perhaps a palm tree. And technically they are singly attached on a very compressed shoot. So it's not easy to see that. But to all intents and purposes, it looks like a cluster of more than 10 needles coming from a single point on the twig. Okay, so single, bunches of 2, 3, or 5, or clusters of more than 10. So let's look at single needles first. So we've spoken about how they're arranged on the shoot, but also how are they directly attached to the shoot. So this is where you will probably need your hand lens. And we want to be looking right at the point where the green part joins the shoot or the twig. And we've got 2 general variations on a theme. So the first one on the left there, we describe as peg-like, because when the needles fall, it leaves a little peg. And you might be familiar with that if you had one of the traditional Christmas trees that left loads of needles in your carpet. and the twigs have this kind of rough, toothy appearance, or are they sucker-like? So a bit like a squid sucker or an octopus sucker attached and leaving a very distinct circular scar in the image on the right there when the needles fall off. So if they're single needles and the attachment is peg-like, and more or less the needles are generally the same length, we're looking at spruce or Picea, which is the genus. And all spruces have that peg-like attachment. Now, the best way to see that is look for a twig where the needles have fallen naturally. Don't try and pull them off. Some of the books will tell you that's the way to do it. Quite often you end up pulling a little strip of bark with it as well, but look for a place where they've fallen naturally. And again, think of a traditional Christmas tree spruce that's lost its needles, and you can get an idea of that rough pattern of bark with all those pegs sticking out. The other thing about spruce is the cones always hang down, so keep an eye out for that as well. Now, there is another genus which tries to be a spruce but doesn't quite manage it. So we've still got single needles, and they still have what could be described as a peg-like attachment. But crucially, the main species of this genus that you'll see in the British Isles has needles of different lengths all over the twig. And in the image on the left, you can see some very short ones in the middle of the twig, and then some longer ones elsewhere. And the image on the right shows you those little peg-like attachments. Now, this is hemlock or Tsuga heterophylla, and heterophylla does mean unequal leaves, so it's a bit of a clue in the name there. How about the suckers? So here we've got single needles with a sucker-like attachment, that image on the left, and these, if you do pull a needle off, do come away quite clean, and you get this nice little circular scar. The cones are always upright on this particular one. And that sucker-like attachment, especially coupled with the upright cones, tells you you're looking at a true fir or an Abies or Abies species. Now those cones, beautiful sometimes with lots of resin on, frequently shatter in situ, so they don't fall to the ground normally when they're intact. Instead, the cone breaks up on the tree and we get the seeds wafting down on the breeze, as well as the old scales as well. So the tree underneath here might be littered with scales. And in the picture on the right, I think you can see a central core there. And sometimes that's called a candle or a pencil. If you get your binoculars and look up at the top of the tree where these cones form, you can quite often see last year's candles still on the tree. So single needles, sucker-like attachment, cones upright. You're looking at a true fir or an Abies. Now, as with the spruce, there's a wannabe there. And if you think you've got sucker-like attachment, I would say look at the buds next at the tip of the growing shoots. And if it's a sharp pointed bud, it's very unlikely that it's a true fir. Have a look for some cones, because this tree is prolific with its cones, and they all hang down. They don't stand upright, and they fall entire from the tree. But really importantly, in the photo on the right, we can see these tongue-like bracts with 3 points at the tip. And that really is diagnostic for one species that you're going to see, and that's Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga menzesii. And that, I would say, is, after monkey puzzle, probably one of the most readily identifiable conifers that you're going to see commonly in the wild. It's widely planted as a forestry species. So how about needles in bunches of 2, 3, or 5? Now, I'm just going to qualify this by saying occasionally they don't follow the rules and you will get single needles, but generally they'll be in this bunch or fascicle of 2 needles on the left, 3 needles in the middle, or 5 needles on the right. And that structure of a little bunch of needles held together with that little sort of woody peg at the bottom, it's pine or pinus. So with those, you need to count the number of needles in a bunch, and also look at the length of the needles and how stiff they are. Are they soft and floppy, or are they really stiff? and that will help you get down to the species in pine. But if it's a bunch of 2, 3, or 5, you know you're looking at a pine. The cones are quite variable, so they can be quite hard and solid. Sometimes they'll have spines like this one in the middle on the tips of the scales, and some of them fall from the tree after 2 years. Others stay on the tree for 20, 30, 40, 50, even 60 years. This picture on the right, so you can see those big cones. These are kind of fist-sized. And that's a fire adaptation in their native environment. They will sit there until a fire comes through and opens those cones and drops the seeds. So have a look out for the cones as well with the pines. They can, coupled with the needles, be helpful. How about clusters? So this is the clusters of more than 10. And I'm just going to put another feature here, and single. So this is one of the reasons I say you need to look over the whole tree. And here in the photograph on the left, we can see those chimney sweep-like brushes or clusters of more than 10 on the older part of the shoot. But on the fresh growth, so in the past year this has grown on the left, we have single needles. Look at the texture of those needles. Are they soft? And if you pull one off and roll it between your fingers, does it basically crumple into a ball pretty quickly? And crucially, is it deciduous? Now, you're not going to know this if it's the summer, but those needles will be soft. And this tells you pretty quickly that you're looking at a larch or a larix species. Now, there are 3 that you're going to see commonly in the wild. They're all planted as forestry trees, or I should qualify that and say they were, because unfortunately they've been hit very badly by a fungus-like pathogen called Phytophthora ramorum. Especially if you're familiar with the west of Scotland, you'll have seen a lot of larch being felled in recent years, Western Wales and also southwest England as well. This is where the fungus is doing the most damage. It's being felled to prevent that fungus jumping onto other trees. Now, it only produces spores on larch, but those spores can float in the wind or be transferred in water droplets and infect other trees. So even things like monkey puzzle can get infected, and it is fatal in larches, certainly. So larch cones are quite small, and they can help with identifying which one you're looking at. But we've got 2 species and a hybrid, and to be honest, it's a continuum between the 2 species. So it's not always easy to tell, but have a look for those cones and look for soft needles in clusters of more than 10 and single. Sticking with the needles in clusters of more than 10 and single on a shoot, and again in the picture on the left, we can see the chimney sweep-like structures with the cluster of more than 10, but also the single needles quite clearly on the newer part of the shoot, on the right of that image. But these needles are stiff. So if we pull one of these off and roll it between our finger and thumb, it will just roll clunkily because it's square in cross section, but it's not soft. It won't roll up into a ball like the larches. And that tells you you're looking at a cedar, but a true cedar. And we've got 3 species of that you will see very commonly in parks and gardens. All of them have upright cones, a bit like the abies. And again, like the abies, those cones don't fall intact generally, but when they're ripe and brown, they shatter and the seeds and the scales fall to the ground separately. So very common as a parkland tree and in former stately homes, especially cedar of Lebanon and Atlas cedar. But have a look out for that. So needles and clusters of more than 10 and singly on the longer parts of the shoot, but stiff and evergreen, and you're looking at true cedar or cedrus. So that's the needle-like foliage. Now, the scale-like foliage tends to scare people because these all look the same. But with your hand lens, I hope you'll very quickly see they're not. And I'm just going to skip back. So we've got an example of very flat scale-like foliage on the left with those lovely white markings underneath. And we've got some more three-dimensional scale-like foliage, and this will have a square cross-section essentially. And those are the two real forms of scale-like foliage that you might come across. So if you've got scales, I would say next, have a look for cones. Now, most of these are pretty good at producing cones, so they can be helpful. And crucially, are the cones rounded or more or less spherical? They might be a little bit sort of globular, or do they look like little vases or tulips in the picture on the right? So if you've got scale-like foliage and the cones are rounded, really, you're looking at the cypresses and the false cypresses, or cupressus. Now, this used to be split into far more different families, but they've all been lumped into one, and especially cupressus, the genus. So things like Conifer are now cupressus. Now, another feature of these is they're quite often very strongly aromatic or fragrant, pungent. Certainly some aren't, but a lot are. And this picture on the right now, you can see what look like little white dots in the middle of the scale like leaves, and those are resin glands. Now, sometimes they are translucent, quite often they're not, but you can still see them on the surface of the leaf as a little kind of blister, if you like. And if you very delicately prick those with a pin, you'll get a really strong hit of the fragrance. But definitely, again, with these, have a little crush of the foliage. But really, you're looking for, is the foliage three-dimensional, so all over the place? Or is it flattened in a single plane? And a good way to think about this is if I pick a shoot and I put it on the table in front of me, does it lay flat like a sheet of paper, or does it stand nicely proud of the table? So three-dimensional or two-dimensional, that's another really good character to look at. Now, again, if we've got scale-like foliage and the cones are rounded, you are looking at a cypress or a false cypress, which, as I say, they've now all been bundled into the same genus of cupressus. But looking at the cones, how big are they? Are they more than 1 centimetre across, or are they less? And that's quite a good dividing boundary. And are they smooth, or more or less the ones on the left, or do they have little spines in the centre of the individual scales? Sometimes they might just look a bit wrinkled. And these are all examples of unripe cones here, so they will turn brown eventually, and each of those scales will open up and then the seeds will fall out. So have a look at those cones and look for any surface features, because that can help. Generally, if the cones are bigger than 1 centimetre, you're looking at what have always been the cypresses or the cupressus. If they're less, generally it's the false cypresses, or what used to be Coniferous or Xanthocypris, and those are on the right. If you have scale-like foliage and the cones are tulip-like or vase-like, now these are ripened cones here, so they've gone nice and brown. Then we're looking at arbor vitae or thuya. Most of these are scented, and in the Mitchell book there is a good key to the scent. Now, let me just skip back. It varies from, what was the description? Apple pie with cloves to fruitcake with almonds, or green apple skins. I don't necessarily agree with those, but does it smell fruity? Like Penny Chews, the fruit salad ones, or Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Chewing Gum? or possibly even like a pack of Starburst. But once you've got that smell in your head, you can usually split these from other flat or two-dimensional leaved conifers quite quickly just by that smell. And you can smell it by brushing past a thuya. You get a really strong hit of this fruity smell. So have a look for that. And also, again, look for these resin vessels on the surface of the needles. Now, none of them are translucent in this case, but you'll see them as little blisters or bumps. So hand lens and have a look at those. Now, I'm going to give you the other two sort of main natives as well. They don't necessarily fit strictly into the former splits, but juniper, or Juniperus communis, which is fairly common in Scotland, has distinctly sharp pointed needles in whorls of 3. So in the image on the left, if I were to slice that just above where the needles emerge, I would see a nice little arrangement of 3 needles coming out from the same level of the shoot. And that's a really good character to ID these. There are other junipers in cultivation which don't have this arrangement. So we need to be a bit mindful of those. But in the wild, certainly, our native juniper has this needle formation. And it's another conifer that doesn't have cones as we know them, but berry-like structures. And these, as I said earlier, are used to flavour gin. And they start green and ripen to a nice deep sort of black. Now, this is also under attack from a Phytophthora. In this case, Phytophthora, and I might get this wrong, I think it's Ostracedri. And this is killing juniper all over the British Isles, and it's transferred in soil. So this is my chance to do my biosecurity bit and say, if you're going to look at things like juniper, or in fact, going in any woodland, I strongly encourage you to clean your boots before you leave the site, and especially if you're then going to go to another site, but certainly clean them when you get home, and preferably clean them before you go out to a site as well, just to be sure. Because being botanists, we tend to like to go to sites where interesting things are, and there's a good chance we're inadvertently spreading Phytophthora around the place. More importantly, we might be spreading something we don't yet know about. So boot cleaning is a really good habit to get into. I've done my biosecurity bit. Our other native conifer, yew, or Taxus baccata, very common, also has single needles, but the twigs stay green for at least 2 years, sometimes 3. So all of the conifers will have green twigs in their first year of growth, but then they quickly ripen and turn woody and brown. Yew doesn't. It retains that for several years. And looking at the image on the right, we can see the needles also kind of blend into the shoot. They don't have a very distinct peg or sucker-like attachment. That needle just seems to continue on into the shoot itself. And of course, we've got the classic yew berries, this fleshy red aril, as it's also known, that surrounds the black seed. Now, I probably don't need to tell you this, the yew is very toxic. Allegedly, you can eat the red fleshy bit and spit the seeds out, and you'll be absolutely fine. I choose not to do that, just in case. But it's very common, and you'll see that all over the place. There's some other things you might see, especially in parks. Now, I'm not going to go into these in detail because they're not very common. But if they don't cleanly fit any of those other categories, but you still have a feel it's a conifer, then it's probably going to be one of these. The honorary conifer, so it's not strictly a conifer, but it is a gymnosperm, it's ginkgo. And that has incredibly distinctive fan-shaped leaves. It's also deciduous, so not so common in Scotland, but still in parks, still sometimes as a street tree. I've seen it planted as a street tree in places like Bristol, where it's doing very, very well. Turns a brilliant yellow in the autumn. The other tree you will see a lot of is monkey puzzle. So the bottom left photo, again, unmistakable, big, spiky, thick, evergreen leaves. basically a defense against dinosaurs and other big herbivores. These are a very ancient group of plants, and there aren't very many survivors of that genus. I should have said ginkgo is the only one in its entire family, although there were many, many of them back in time. The four on the right are all members of what used to be the Redwood family, or Taxodiaceae, have now all been put into the cypress family. So they don't separate out very easily, but they have a range of needle forms, ranging from, in the top middle image, what look like kind of talons or possibly needles, to short, sort of more claw-like structures, in the image on the top right, to more feathery. So bottom middle, very fresh green feathery, or plasticky, thick, leathery on the bottom right. Now, those are all members of the Redwood family. So top middle is Cryptomeria, or Japanese cedar. Top right is giant redwood, pretty common in avenue plantings, stately homes. Bottom middle is dawn redwood, Metasequoia. So that was only discovered in 1948, and was widely, well, that was when it first came into the UK, sorry, 1948. It's widely planted for the Queen's Silver Jubilee, sorry, her coronation, not a Jubilee, that was 1977. So a lot of the trees you'll see, if they're mature, will have been planted in 1952. And again, fairly common in parks and gardens, but increasingly planted as a street tree. Places like Canary Wharf, there are avenues of it, and it's deciduous. It turns a lovely golden colour in the autumn and has this bright green feathery leaf in the spring. And lastly, bottom right is coast redwood. So the planet's tallest tree, about 100, 110, 112 metres tall, generally. Big trees, seriously big trees, and pretty common in the UK as avenues as well. So those are just some other things that you might see around and about the place. Just to recap then, are the leaves needle-like or scale-like, plus those few exceptions we've just talked about? And how are they attached to the shoots? So are they single? Are they in clusters? How many in a cluster? Or do they just blend seamlessly into the shoot? What are the cones like? And what shape are they? Are they upright? Do they hang down? And do they fall from the tree intact? Or do they disintegrate into lots of pieces before they hit the ground? And finally, any other features? So what does the foliage smell like? And perhaps you can see some hairs on the shoots, and your hand lens will be needed here. Or perhaps you can see some white markings on the needles as well. But with those four questions, you can certainly get to genus quickly. And with the bottom two there, what are the cones like? And are there any other features? Needle length possibly as well. You can quickly get to species. So hopefully that's demystified conifer identification a bit and encourages you to get out there and have a little look. So I'll finish there. It's a bit of a gallop. I'm sure there are some questions ready and waiting, so I'm quite happy to run through those with you now.